It is often said that monsters are born from the darkness, from the deformed corners of nature. But is that really so? Or are monsters created not by God, but by our own eyes? They are molded by fear, shaped by superstition, and named by human cruelty. This story is not just about a being called a monster. It is about a journey to find out who the monsters really are, in a world where the line between human and demon is sometimes as thin as a whisper. In 17th century Spain, a time of greatness, faith, and extreme fanaticism, a child was born. A child who would become a mirror reflecting the corruption of an entire empire and forcing us, hundreds of years later, to face a terrifying question. When we stare at a monster, is the reflection we see ourselves? In the summer of 1674, in the barren village of Brega, where rocks were more plentiful than soil and faith was greater than compassion, Isabel Martinez Vigo gave birth to a daughter. But in the small room, there was no cheering, only a heavy, oppressive silence. The newborn, Eugenia, was different from the first breath. Her cries were louder, echoing in an unusual way. Her limbs were plump and round, and her hunger seemed never-ending. The midwife, a sinewy woman whose eyes had seen too much life and death, could only cross herself and mumble curses. The problem wasn't Eugenia. The problem was that, in a world that looked to divine explanations for every calamity, from drought to plague, a body that didn't conform to the norm could only be an omen, a sign of sin, a punishment. The villagers didn't see a newborn in need of love. They saw a mistake. And as they looked, they began to define. The whispers at the well, in the church, in the fields, had already woven a name, a verdict, into Eugenia before she could even speak. La Monstrua, the monster. Eugenia's misfortune was not her body, but that she was born among people who needed a monster to blame for their own fears. Her mother, Isabel, cried not because of her deformed child, but because of the weight of judgment she bore. Her father, Matteo, remained silent, not because he was ashamed of his daughter, but because he was helpless in the face of the cruelty of the community. They had tried to love her, but how could their love stand against the hatred of an entire village? Eugenia grew up in an invisible cage of stares and rumors. Other children threw stones at her, called her names with cruel words. Her world was confined to the four walls of the cottage, the only place she could find warmth in her mother's tired hands. She did not understand why she was different, why her existence brought sadness to her parents and disgust to others. She only knew that, beyond that door, was a world that did not welcome her. The curse was not in her blood. It was in the air she breathed, in the whispers carried by the wind. And the winds of Castile did not blow only around the small village. They carried the story of the monster of Brega, blowing it over the hills, over the fields, to places far away, more powerful, and far more cruel. The whispers at last found a destination. They did not dissipate into the air, but gathered, thickened, and seeped into the marble corridors of the royal palace in Madrid. The court of Charles II, a world of isolated, empty splendor, where great wealth bred boundless boredom. In that gilded cage, the nobility, after generations of inbreeding and living in luxury that had lost touch with reality, craved novelty, bizarre amusements to fill the void of their souls. They were tired of balls, hunts, plays. They needed something primitive, something that challenged order, something they could both marvel at and despise, to feel alive, still powerful. They did not need a saint. They needed a monster, and the wind of Castile brought them the answer. One day, as the sun burned over the half-burnt wheat fields, a figure appeared on the horizon of Brega. A knight, unlike any they had ever seen. The man, Don Gonzalo, wore royal regalia, a tunic embroidered with a lion and castle, his face as cold and impassive as a statue. He had not come to grant favors. He had come to execute wills. The villagers gathered in silence, their eyes a mixture of awe at his authority and a vague fear of what was to come. The father, Matteo, wiped his dusty hands from his face as he emerged from the dilapidated cottage. The peasant's calloused hands trembled as he took the parchment from Don Gonzalo's gloved hand. a gentle touch between two worlds completely different, one of hard work and care, the other of cold, absolute power. The royal wax seal, which Matteo had only seen on the decrees of bishops in the church, now rested in his hands, carrying with it the fate of his own daughter. The village scribe was called, and his voice trembled as he read aloud each word written in a flowing yet heavy script. By order of His Catholic Majesty Charles II, King of Spain, the child known as Eugenia Martinez Vallejo is summoned to the Royal Court of Madrid, there to be presented to the nobility for examination and amusement. Consider and enjoy. The last two words hung in the air, cruel and clear. Eugenia had not been summoned as a guest or a patient to be cured. She had been summoned as an object, a curio to be displayed. Isabel, her mother, cried out a no and hugged her poor daughter as if her arms could shield her from the dictates of an empire. But Don Gonzalo's gaze did not waver. "The king's will cannot be questioned," he said, his voice as decisive as a knife. To appease that feeble protest, he added a sentence, a beautiful lie to cover up the cruelty. "The child is a wonder, a masterpiece of creation. His Majesty wishes to see her." It was a perfect trap. They didn't call her a monster. They called her a wonder. They didn't say they wanted to mock her. They said they wanted to admire. They had turned their morbid curiosity into an artistic fetish, turned kidnapping a child into a privilege. Her family had no reason to refuse. The separation was swift and brutal. Eugenia was dressed in a hastily made dress, tight and uncomfortable. Matteo thrust a wooden cross into her hand, a last, helpless fatherly comfort. "God is with you." But on the dusty road to Madrid, it seemed that only the king's will prevailed. The carriage, though luxurious, was a prison cell. Don Gonzalo treated her like a precious commodity to be carefully guarded until the day of her presentation, with no words of comfort, only terse orders. In the end, she was hidden, isolated. She was nothing more than a prize, a royal secret, waiting to be unveiled to the admiration and disgust of the Madrid court. The carriage finally stopped, not in front of a shabby inn, but in the middle of a sunlit, marble-paved courtyard surrounded by the gilded walls of the Alcazar. The air in Madrid was thick, not the smell of earth and burnt wheat as in Brega, but a mixture of wealth, power, and invisible stench of decay. Don Gonzalo yanked the door open, his voice dry. "Get out. And remember, you are here to be seen, not heard." Eugenia stepped down, her feet trembling on the unfamiliar ground. For a moment, the courtyard seemed to fall silent. The chatter of the courtiers in their silks and powdered wigs stopped. Dozens of eyes, like those of hawks, focused on her. But there was no pity in their gazes, only a cold hunger, the judgment of connoisseurs of the bazaar. They did not see her as a child forcibly taken from her family. They saw her as a new object of art, a living statue delightfully bizarre, as one duke had whispered behind his fan. The palace hall was another world. The light of thousands of candles danced on the gilded walls, on the jewels on the nobles' dresses. The smell of beeswax and rosewater was so strong it made Eugenia dizzy. The peasant girl, whose world had been nothing but a cottage and a small garden, now stood in the midst of the greatness and cruelty of an empire. And at the end of the hall, on a throne, sat King Charles II. The king's pale, long face, the legacy of many generations of royalty, showed no emotion except a cold curiosity, like a scientist about to dissect a strange creature. He was not looking at Eugenia, he was looking at a phenomenon. His weak but authoritative voice rang out, "Bring her here." The first act of turning a human being into an object had begun. Don Gonzalo nudged Eugenia in the back, pushing her forward. Then the king commanded, "Turn around." She hesitated, confused. The command was repeated, and this time Don Gonzalo grabbed her by the shoulders and spun her around. The room erupted in gasps and cheers of delight. "Wonderful! A bounty of flesh!" One of the bishops clapped. They circled her, commenting on the size of her arms, the bulge of her belly, as if appraising cattle at a fair. But passive observation was not enough. Cruelty required action. "Can she dance?" asked the Duchess in a falsely sweet voice. Immediately, a violinist struck up a lively tune. The court clapped in time, their eyes sharp and expectant. Tears welled in her eyes, and Eugenia was forced to move. She swayed awkwardly, her heavy body making each step a struggle. And their laughter grew louder, a cacophony of mockery. The humiliation was heightened when the king commanded, "Feed her. I want to see how much she can eat." This was the show they had really been waiting for. They wanted to confirm the rumors, to witness with their own eyes what they believed to be her monstrous nature, her insatiable appetite. A table laden with food was brought out. Eugenia's stomach, already racked by hunger, was now churning for a different reason. Food was no longer meant to nourish her. It had become an instrument of torture. She shakily picked up a loaf of bread, and as soon as she brought it to her mouth, the room erupted in triumphant cheers. "Like a pig at the trough," someone shouted. Eugenia chewed mechanically, the sweet taste of the bread turning to ashes in her mouth. When the plates were empty, the king yawned, looking bored. The fun was over. "Give it away," he said, waving his hand. The toy had served its purpose for the day. As the guards dragged her out of the hall, the whispers followed, analyzing, commenting. That night, in her cold, unfamiliar cell, Eugenia clutched the wooden cross in her palm until it was embedded in her flesh. It was the only thing left that connected her to her old world, to her old identity. But she knew that from now on, she was no longer Eugenia. She was the king's La Monstrua. If there was one rule in the courts, it was that all novelty eventually wears off. But cruelty did not. As the initial awe of Eugenia's size faded, the nobility did not let her go. Instead, they demanded more. Their curiosity evolved into something darker, a sick hunger for amusement, a secret competition to see who could devise the most elaborate and cruel humiliation. Eugenia was no longer a passive object of display. Now she was an actress in her own tragedy. They began by turning fashion, the pride of the nobility, into an instrument of torture. A satin gown was brought in, a blatant mockery. It was cut so tight, the corset so cruelly tightened, that Eugenia's every breath was a painful effort. When she stepped out, the whole room burst into laughter. "Look, a sin in satin," someone exclaimed. And then, with a sneer, the king commanded, "Dance, monster." This time, she fell. The crash onto the wooden stage echoed through the hall. But instead of silence, she was met with applause and cheers of delight. Her fall was the perfect end to their amusement. Their creativity knew no bounds. They dressed her in armor that was too small, declared her a great fat knight, and poked her with sticks made of precious wood, sending her staggering through the halls in wild laughter. They took the symbol of honor and courage and turned it into a farce. They demonstrated that in their world, nothing was sacred. Everything could be twisted for entertainment. And then came the weighings, a ritual. A giant iron and bronze scale was brought out. Eugenia was forced to step on it, her face burning with shame as the needles whirled and settled on an impossible number. There were gasps of "oh, but not admiration, but morbid satisfaction. They had quantified her strangeness, turned her into a number they could comment on, compare, remember. A titan of the flesh, one duke declared. But the climax of the cruelty, the moment that would have made even the most hardened soul shudder, came on the night of St. John's Day. Instead of the great hall, Eugenia was led to the garden, where a great marble fountain had been drained. By the flickering light of torches, the king solemnly announced, "Tonight our monster will bathe us." A murmur of delight ran through the crowd. The servants had filled the basin with red wine, a river of crimson sparkling in the firelight. It was a display of power and a disgusting waste. "Come in," a countess urged, her voice sickly sweet. "You have surely never tasted such fine wine." Eugenia stood rooted to the spot. The wooden cross, her father's last memento, had been lost somewhere in the chaos of the past few days. She had nothing left to hold on to. As the king's patience wore thin, hands grabbed her, pushing her toward the basin. The wine was cold and slippery. She staggered forward, the liquid rising to her waist as the court cheered. "Drink," Drink. Let's see if she floats. Eugenia closed her eyes, letting the laughter and humiliation wash over her. The wine stained her skin, her hair, her clothes. It was an indelible mark, a cruel baptism, officially turning her into their monster. When they finally pulled her out, wet and shaking, the king applauded and said, "Excellent." That night, in her cell, Eugenia rubbed her skin until it turned red, but the smell of wine and humiliation had seeped deep in her skin, never to be washed away. Physical humiliation, however painful, would pass. Bruises would fade, memories would fade. But the court of Charles II craved something more permanent. They did not want to laugh at Eugenia in the present. They wanted their laughter to echo through the generations. They needed a legacy of cruelty, a lasting testament to their unique pastime. And art, in the hands of those in power, was the perfect tool for freezing a soul into eternal ridicule. This summons took her not to the banquet hall, but to the portrait gallery. This was a sacred space, a long hall lined with the faces of kings and queens, people whose legacies had been carved into history by power and blood. Bringing Eugenia here was like bringing a sacrificial animal into a cathedral. At the back of the room, beside a blank canvas, stood Don Claudio de Vargas, the court painter. He was not an artist with a soaring spirit, but a cold, skilled craftsman, an instrument of the royal will. His gaze swept over Eugenia without emotion, only the technical appraisal of someone about to recreate an object. "The subject has arrived," he said, his voice as sharp as a knife. "Climb and do not move." The seat was covered in luxurious brocade, but to Eugenia, it was no different from an execution platform. Don Claudio circled her, not to find the best angle, but to find the angle that would best show off her deformity. "Turn your face to the light," he commanded. "No, chin up. Let them see your fullness." They were the crowd of aristocrats who had begun to gather, whispering behind their fans, turning the painting into yet another spectacle. They had not come to appreciate the art. They had come to see the process of turning a human being into a caricature. And Don Claudio did not disappoint. His brushstrokes were quick, decisive, and ruthless. He did not paint what he saw. He painted what the court wanted to see. He exaggerated every fold, making her body swell absurdly on the canvas. He ignored the sadness in her eyes, replacing it with a blank, lifeless look. This was not painting, this was dissection in oils. "More," he muttered to himself, "more folds, more bulk. Let them see the absurdity of God's hand." To escape this torture, Eugenia did the only thing she could. She retreated into her inner world. She closed her eyes and thought of Brega, of the smell of olive trees after the rain, of her mother's voice singing by the fire. For a moment, she was no longer in this cold gallery. But then Don Claudio's shout, "Sit still," brought her back to the harsh reality. After several hours, as the light began to fade, the artist stepped back. "The king wishes to see the progress," an attendant announced. Don Claudio turned the canvas toward the crowd. A murmur of amazement and delight spread. On the canvas, a monster was taking shape. It was Eugenia, but not Eugenia. It was an image shaped by contempt, a body distorted by ridicule. The eyes on the canvas were empty, but the pain was clearly there. "Exquisite," the king whispered, his eyes shining. "A true masterpiece of wonder." The king's praise was the final nail in Eugenia's fate. This was how the world would remember her. Not as little Eugenia Martinez Vallejo, but as a monstrous creature, a joke framed in gilded gold. She glanced at her reflection in a nearby mirror. The distorted image seemed to merge with the image on the canvas. They were not just painting a monster. They were turning her into a monster, inside and out. And the most terrible thing, as Don Claudio had announced before the end of the session, was that the painting was only half finished. The torture would continue. How much humiliation can a person endure before their soul breaks? The court of King Charles II seemed determined to find out. That night at the banquet, as Eugenia fell flat on the cold stone floor, the laughter of the nobility struck her like whiplash. But something different happened. For a terrifying moment, when she saw the gleeful faces of her tormentors, Eugenia, no longer saw them. She saw herself through their eyes. She saw a grotesque creature, a farce, a monster. And that reflection was more terrifying than any torture. It was the moment of breaking. Something inside her, long worn away, finally broke. But from the rubble, it was not despair, but a fire that was lit. A silent fire, but a burning one. That night, in the darkness of the cell, a decision was formed. Enough! Eugenia's rebellion did not begin with swords or screams. It began with the simplest of acts, refusal. The next morning, when the servant brought a plate of sumptuous food designed to further feed her voracious monster image, Eugenia turned away. The second day and the third, the dishes were brought with ever more delicious, ever more tempting flavors. It was a test, a temptation, but she still refused to eat. The king will not be pleased, the servant warned. For the first time, Eugenia looked him straight in the eye, her voice quiet but firm. Let it be displeased. The servant was startled. The puppet had never cut its own strings. The next battleground was the portrait gallery. Don Claudio de Vargas summoned her, this time to complete a new masterpiece, a bizarre triptych depicting her alongside a dwarf and a bearded woman. It was a final attempt to cement her as a natural freak. When ordered to climb onto the pedestal, Eugenia folded her arms. "I will not sit for you," she said. The room fell silent. The painter, his face dark with anger, threatened, "You will, or the king will hear about it." Eugenia was undaunted. Then let him hear about it. She was willing to accept physical punishment to protect what remained of her dignity. But her most climactic act of defiance, the act that became her quiet legend, took place during a royal parade. The king, his pride wounded by Eugenia's veiled defiance, decided to humiliate her before the entire court and people. As the carriage passed through the gardens, he leaned out of the window and commanded in a sharp voice, "Kiss the ground, Monstrua. Show your gratitude." The crowd held its breath. This was an absolute command, a complete surrender. Eugenia stopped. The whole carriage stopped. The eyes of the king and the girl met. Then, slowly, Eugenia leaned down. A chuckle rose from the crowd, and they thought she had given up. But she did not press her lips to the dirt. Instead, her fingers gently plucked a small, purple wildflower from the roadside. She stood up, facing the king, and silently twirled the flower between her fingers. She had disobeyed. She had not resisted aggressively. She had replaced an act of humiliation with an act of beauty and gentleness. She had shown that even when backed into a corner, she still had a choice, could still find a shred of dignity, a shred of innocence. The king was stunned, then flushed with anger. "Guards!" he shouted. As she was dragged away, Eugenia did not struggle. She let the flower fall to the ground. That night, in her cell, she heard the guards whispering outside. Even a beast knows when it has been pushed too far. In the darkness, Eugenia smiled. They still called her a beast, but she knew she had won. She might never escape this palace, but her soul, for the first time in years, was free. Eugenia's fire of defiance had brought her victory, but it was a victory known only to her. To the court, her defiance was not an act of admirable courage, but an annoyance. Their toys were broken. Their puppets learned to cut their own strings. And once the fun was over, their interest evaporated like the morning dew. In a world of thrill seekers, there was nothing more boring than a monster who refused to perform. And so, Eugenia was forgotten. This Oblivion was even crueler than the attention she had received. She was removed from the room near the royal quarters and relegated to a damp, cold corner of the servants' quarters. The walls were water-soaked, the straw mattresses thin and infested with bedbugs. There were no more silk and satin dresses, only loose, coarse cloth shirts. There were no more sumptuous feasts, only dry breadcrumbs and thin soup, enough to keep her alive, but not enough to nourish the wonder they had once admired. Ironically, as she began to eat less, her body, the source of all the attention, began to change. She grew thinner, weaker, the folds of flesh that had once made her a phenomenon sagged. She was becoming more normal in her exhaustion, and thus more invisible to them. No one came to see her. No one, except the mice. They were her only companions in the long nights, small, silent creatures, perhaps kinder than the nobles she had known. But then one evening, a sudden ray of humanity crept into Eugenia's darkness. A scullery maid, thin and dirty, crept into her room. Without a word, she slipped a piece of cheese she had been sneaking into Eugenia's hand. "You look hungry," she whispered. It was the first unprovoked act of kindness Eugenia had received in years. Her heart ached. The maid returned in the following days, bringing scraps of food, gossip from the kitchen, and once a small ribbon that she had tied around Eugenia's wrist as a gift. From the maid's words, Eugenia knew that the court had forgotten her completely. "They don't mention your name anymore." Eugenia just smiled. "Good. Don't you want to be remembered?" the girl asked innocently. Eugenia looked into her clear eyes and answered, an answer that contained all the pain and dignity she had regained. "Not that way." But the seasons changed. The maid grew up, and the visits became less frequent and then stopped. Eugenia was alone again. She spent her final days sitting by the narrow window, watching the world outside, which continued to function perfectly without her. She saw new paintings hanging in the Hall of Wonders, replacing the old wonders. Her portrait, once Don Claudio's masterpiece, was now pushed into a dark corner, covered with dust and neglect. Winter came early and bitterly that year. The cold penetrated to her bones, and a hoarse, wet cough began to torment her. No physician was called. No one paid any attention. On the coldest night of winter, when the wind howled through the cracks in the walls like a mourning spirit, Eugenia curled up under the thin blanket and closed her eyes. Her breathing, once the proof of her unusual existence, grew fainter, then stopped altogether in the silence and solitude. The next morning, a servant found her body. He muttered a vague prayer and went to call the gravedigger. "Who was she?" the gravedigger asked as they wrapped her in a cheap shroud. The servant shrugged, his voice indifferent. "No one important." And with that, Eugenia Martinez Vallejo, once the wonder of an entire empire, was wiped out. She was buried in an unmarked grave without a trace. History, with its inherent cruelty, seemed ready to swallow her whole. An unmarked grave, a story buried in the dust of time. That seemed to be the end of Eugenia Martinez Vallejo. The court had succeeded. They had turned a human being into entertainment. And when the entertainment was over, they had erased her from memory, as if she had never existed. History, written by the victors and the powerful, seemed to have closed its book on her. But history has a strange property. It is like water. No matter how hard you try to block it, it will find a way to leak out. And Eugenia's story, buried, continues to haunt the world in unexpected ways. Her official legacy, the one left to her by the court, was the portrait of Don Claudio de Vargas. That painting survived, passing from collection to collection. But people did not see it as a tragic fate. They saw it as a testament to the monstrous. Centuries later, art historians analyzed it in chilling terms, a classic example of the Baroque fascination with the grotesque, noting the artist's dehumanization of the subject. They praised the technique, they analyzed the composition, but they missed the most important thing, the girl screaming silently from within the canvas. Her name, La Monstrua, survived, but not as a person, but as a warning, a tale to scare children. A mother in Castile, scolding her child for overeating, would say, "Be careful not to get fat like La Monstrua." Her tragedy was stripped away, leaving only a caricature. But that is only the legacy that the powerful want to be remembered. Eugenia's true legacy grows quietly elsewhere, in hearts that have not been hardened by cruelty. It exists in the memory of one person. The old kitchen maid, in her old age, returned to Brega. Every year, she goes to the empty space in the churchyard where she believes Eugenia is buried and places a wildflower there. She does not remember the king's wonder. She remembers a lonely woman who is grateful for a piece of cheese. That small act of remembrance holds more truth than all the history books. It lives on in the eyes of a young artist who, hundreds of years later, came across Eugenia's portrait in a hidden corner of a museum. Where others saw only disgust, the The artist saw what Don Claudio had tried to erase, a defiant spark in the eyes, a quiet resilience. The artist sat for hours sketching Eugenia's face, not to copy the monstrosity, but to try to find the stolen girl. And it lives on in the voice of a young poet on stage in Madrid, who cried out one night of poetry. They call you a monster, but who carved that word into your flesh? They feed you until you're full, then laugh when the seams burst. Tell me, which is the greater sin? And that, in turn, is Eugenia's true legacy. Her life, tragic as it was, forced later generations to confront a core question, one that had been asked from the beginning. Who was the monster? Was it the girl born with a body that did not conform? Or was it the entire society, from the superstitious villagers to the hollow royal court, who needed a monster so much that they were willing to create one from an innocent child? Finally, in Brega, a small plaque was erected, giving her back the name that history had tried to take away. The truth, however belated, triumphed over the lie. Eugenia Martinez Vallejo is not remembered as a monster. She is remembered as a haunting question, an eternal reminder of human cruelty and of the extraordinary power of dignity. Eugenia Martinez Vallejo's story is over, but its echoes are not. It reminds us that history is not just about great battles or golden dynasties. History is, above all, the sum of countless human destinies, silent stories often drowned out by the roar of power. Eugenia's fate was determined by two opposing legacies. On one hand, a disfigured portrait hung in opulent halls, a testament to cruelty disguised as art. On the other, the memory of a wildflower, a gentle act of defiance, and the kindness of a poor servant girl. The history of the powerful chose to remember the portrait, but the history of humanity cherished the wildflower. Perhaps, in the end, what Eugenia wanted was not to be remembered as a hero or a victim. Perhaps she simply wanted to live a simple life in Brega, to feel the warmth of her mother's hearth, and to see pride, rather than shame, in her father's eyes. She did not choose to be a wonder, she was made into one. The splendid stage of the royal court was never her dream, it was her prison. So when we look back on this story, perhaps the most meaningful tribute is not to analyze the brutality of the past, but to take a moment to acknowledge the pain of a human being, to look beyond the caricature to see a little girl fighting for her soul. And perhaps Eugenia's greatest lesson lies not in the 17th century, but in the present. It is a reminder to choose kindness over judgment, to look for the humanity behind the different appearances, and to be the person who hands out a piece of cheese in the dark, rather than the person who throws a stone in the sun.